Again, I'm Brian Graff, and we're from the Jefferson, and I just want to thank you all for your interest in this topic. You're either very interested in balloons, or you're very interested in the Civil War, or you're interested in both, and I hope to be able to build on that. And so I want to talk about the origins of the Union Balloon Corps, 1861, and I just want to assure you right now that I know that those pictures were not taken in 1861. I don't lose any credibility out of the box. Like, does this guy even know that those were not taken in 1861? But I have them on the first slide because it means something to me. Does anybody recognize where this may have come from? Has anybody seen these pictures before or know where it might have come from? Well, I'm going to take you back to October 22nd, 1972, The Wonderful World of Disney. This is where I first heard of Professor Thaddeus Lowe, who we're going to talk about tonight, and the Union Balloon Corps. I was 12 years old. This was part of a three-part miniseries on The Wonderful World of Disney. And once I saw this episode, I was really hooked on balloons and the Civil War. So I just thought I'd put it up there as I can actually state the actual date, October 22nd, 1972, is when I first became familiar with this topic, 12 years old. And now I'm 65, so a lot of time in between. But I do know that those are not pictures from the period, okay?
You be trying to dig.
Oops. So here is how my talk will proceed tonight. I'm going to start with a brief biographical background of Thaddeus Lowe, who would eventually become the lead aeronaut of the Union Balloon Corps. I'll cover Lowe's initial attempts to sell the War Department on the military applications of balloons at the outset of the Civil War in 1861. I'm going to then cover two rivals of Lowe's who came to Washington with their own balloons and their attempts to market them to the War Department. And most importantly, we're going to look at how balloons were used in the field in 1861 and the difficulties of technology transition, i.e. the difficulty of using peacetime balloons in military applications. Now, the whole Union Balloon Corps hinged on its creator and lead aeronaut, Thaddeus Sobieski Constantine Lowe, i.e. the professor. He did like to shorten his three names with the initials TSC. Much of his Civil War report and correspondence ends with TSC Lowe. He was born in Jefferson Mills, New Hampshire in 1832. He liked all the sciences, especially mechanics and chemistry. At the age of 11, he moved to Boston to be an apprentice in shoemaking with his brother. While there, he developed an interest in kites and started building progressively larger kites till he built one that carried a cat successfully. He only did that once, and he swore to never use animals again, which he actually never did. While in Boston at 18, he was hired by a local professor to be his aide. Lowe did this for 2 years and saved enough money to build his own portable lab and started traveling, giving lectures of his own. He started gathering any information he could on aeronautics. He met his future wife, Leontine Augustine Gauchen, while lecturing in New York. She actually met him during one of his lectures, and so by all accounts, their marriage was a very happy marriage, and she is to have a significant role to play in his Civil War ballooning career. They did everything together, and he definitely relied on her heavily. So Lowe bought his first balloon in 1856 and immediately determined that it was too small to meet his needs. Now, what needs could these be? As at this time, they became obsessed with being the first man to cross the Atlantic Ocean in a balloon. He believed strongly that at high altitudes there was prevailing air current moving west to east, what we know now as the Gulf Stream. As the airstream. He believed strongly, again, that at high altitudes there was a prevailing air current moving west to east. He believed that with sufficient altitude, he could catch this easterly current and fly across the Atlantic. He stated at this time that as early as 1853, he was sending small hydrogen balloons aloft to determine prevailing air currents. He would need a larger balloon to cross the Atlantic. To raise funds, he performed balloon exhibitions and started charging fees for excursions. $1 for short trips, $5 for longer trips, and Leontine would do marionette shows for children. In 1858, Lowe watched closely the results of a flight test of the balloon Atlantic which flew 4 balloonists from St. Louis to Henderson, New York, that demonstrated the feasibility of prevailing west to east winds. This flight was led by John Wise, the elder statesman of American balloonists. However, this flight was also very risky as the aeronauts had trouble controlling their balloon and their landing was a crash landing. But based on the success of the Atlantic flight, Lowe sought and received funding to build his own large balloon, the City of New York. Now, the design was impressive. Construction began in July 1859 in Hoboken, New Jersey, with financial backing from local investors. Since all balloons lost gas through leakage, Lowe reasoned that he would need a large balloon that could last the 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean. This resulted in a balloon with a 130-foot envelope, which means 130-foot diameter of the balloon, which is almost half a football field. That's how big that balloon was going to be. And a capacity of 726,000 cubic feet. The balloons that he used in the Civil War only had a capacity of 32,000 cubic feet. So you can see how large this balloon was. The balloon also had a large 20-foot diameter rattan basket with a trapdoor in the base, which led to a large steam-powered lifeboat. The 4-horsepower engine was to be designed and built by John Erickson, who was the future designer of the ironclad Monitor. Yes. Now, the City of New York was due to be launched at the end of October 1859, but it never left the ground. Lowe was promised by the City of New York Gas Company that it could provide 500,000 cubic feet of coal gas in a 24-hour period. But as time came close to inflate the balloon, he was informed that it could only provide 50,000 cubic feet of gas per day, and it would take 10 days to inflate the balloon. So over a 10-day period, so much gas would escape the balloon as it was being inflated that it would never be fully inflated. So Lowe tried anyway to inflate the balloon, but it never got more than 1/3 inflated. It never left the ground, and Lowe took a lot of heat in the press. He was accused of being a fraud and a humbug. Yes. So despite what happened in New York, Lowe was given a chance to try again. In the fall of 1859, John C. Cresson was president of the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. More importantly, he was the president of the board of directors for the Philadelphia Gas Works. Cresson was aware of the problems that Lowe had in New York and invited Lowe to bring his balloon to Philadelphia, where it could be supplied with sufficient gas free of cost. So in November, Lowe shipped the balloon and equipment in 8 freight cars to Philadelphia. But there were some delays. He gets to Philadelphia and determines that flying across the Atlantic in winter is not an optimal time to go. So he stored the balloon in winter quarters and then traveled to Charleston, South Carolina with his wife. Now this was a working vacation. So during the winter of 1859, 1860, Lowe made many ascents with a smaller balloon to study air currents. When he returned in the spring, his investors wanted him to do more experiments of upper air currents before attempting to cross the Atlantic, which he did. And finally, on June 28, 1860, in a test flight, the Great Western took to the air over Philadelphia. It ascended to an altitude of over 2.5 miles and landed 18 miles to the east near Atlantic City. Another attempt to launch the Great Western on September 8, 1860, the balloon exploded as it was being inflated. But Lowe was still not deterred. He immediately set out to repair the balloon to try again to launch. So one thing we're sort of learning about Thaddeus Lowe is he's not a quitter. I mean, he doesn't know the word no. He's very stubborn, which is going to actually be in his favor when we get to the rest of the story. Like that. So investors are not convinced that the large balloon is safe enough to cross the Atlantic. They actually like Lowe. They're actually concerned for his safety and his life. And so in December 1860, the investors wrote Joseph Henry and asked him to provide guidance on what steps Lowe should take next regarding crossing the Atlantic. Joseph Henry is a well-known physicist and the first secretary of the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. So he candidly assessed the prospects of success of a transatlantic balloon flight and wrote a detailed letter back to Lowe. He stated that provided a balloon can be constructed of sufficient size and of sufficient impermeability to gas in order that it may attain a high elevation for a sufficient length of time, it would be wafted across the Atlantic. But I would not, however, advise that the first experiment of this character be made across the ocean, but that the feasibility be thoroughly tested by a voyage over the interior of our continent. In other words, let's start by flying across maybe the United States before where you at least you have land under you versus trying to cross the Atlantic. So Low accepted Henry's assessment. He traveled to Washington in January 1861 and met with Joseph Henry in person. At this meeting, Henry told Low, "You must start your trial voyage in some locality in the West. If you make success, everyone will know about it." He also advised him to take off on a day where there's a strong wind blowing from east to west so that he could prove that if we actually traveled west to east, it was because of the strong westerly winds in the upper atmosphere. So Low took Henry's advice and constructed a smaller balloon, which he named Enterprise. He did go out west and chose Cincinnati as a starting point. So he arrived in Cincinnati in late March 1861. The city embraced Low, and he was the featured guest at many dinners and banquets. This was due to the patronage of Murat Halstead, editor of the Cincinnati Daily Commercial. So this photograph shows the Enterprise partially inflated prior to the flight. The Enterprise was kept continually partially inflated until the weather conditions would present themselves to complete filling the balloon. On the evening of April 19, 1861, Low was at another banquet when the wind conditions suddenly became ideal for launch. A strong wind blowing from the west. He was dressed in a frock coat and tails and did not have time to change. There was no time to provision the balloon properly, so food was brought from the banquet and put on the Enterprise. She lifted off at 3:30 a.m. in the morning with copies of the morning's newspapers thrown in the basket. So then what happened? Now here's a map that shows the estimated route that Low's balloon took on April 20th, 1861. Enterprise did reach the eastward winds of the upper atmosphere and was driven towards the east coast. His balloon traveled an estimated 650 miles in 9 hours. He landed in a pasture of a farm near Unionville, South Carolina. He was not expecting the reception that he got. He was not tracking current events very closely. Does anybody know what event occurred in April 1861 that may have had an impact on the reception that Low would receive? April 1861. Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was fired on shortly before Low took off on his voyage. And again, Low wasn't tracking this. Now he's landed in Unionville, South Carolina, the same state where Fort Sumter was fired on. So he landed near some sharecropper shacks and managed with the help of a young lady to secure the Enterprise to a rail fence. He got the basket to the ground and then started to release the rest of the gas from the balloon. Immediately he was beset by a number of locals who immediately assumed that he was a Yankee spy. He tried to explain to them about his test flight and how he had just been in Cincinnati earlier that morning. He gave them food that he still had left from the buffet. The crowd kept growing, now with people coming on horseback and carriages. Many of them were armed. Some of the crowd threatened Low and wanted to hang him on the spot. Low reached into his satchel and pulled out a Colt revolver and threatened to shoot anyone who moved aggressively toward him. He suggested that a committee be formed to take him to the county seat and allow the authorities to determine his fate. That's one cool cucumber, I'll tell you that. I mean, to think that calmly with what he was dealing with. So this was agreed to. He finished deflating the Enterprise and put the fabric into the basket. Low and his balloon were then taken to Unionville, South Carolina. When they arrived at Unionville, the men stopped at the jailhouse, but there was no room for Low, so they took him to a nearby inn. They woke up the innkeeper, whose name was Mr. Black. Amazingly, this man rushed up to Low and addressed him by name, Professor Low. It turns out that Black had met Low in South Carolina the previous winter, and Low had actually taken him up in his balloon. This mollified the crowd, and they apologized to Low. He now became a local celebrity and was taken around the streets of Unionville in a carriage for about 3 hours, waving to the crowd. But his trials were not over. He then put himself and a balloon, and the balloon Enterprise, on a train to Columbia, South Carolina, from where he hoped to catch a train to Washington. There he was arrested by a sheriff who said that his arrest had been ordered by the civil and military authorities. So he was held in jail in Columbia, and again, a large hostile crowd formed. The mayor of Columbia met with Low and believed his story, so he suggested that they walk around the streets together to show that Low was harmless. Low eventually caught a train to Cincinnati and returned from where he had left. So this illustration is actually, from the period. This is what, it was done in 1861, and this is at least trying to show what Thaddeus Low might have dealt with when he crash landed in Unionville. From his perspective, Low's landing in Unionville was worth noting, with both a roadside marker and a marker at the actual site of the landing. Just as a side note, it does seem like wherever Lowe's balloons were during the Civil War, it would result in a roadside or historical marker. I'm going to show you some examples of that later. But his landing in Unionville made enough of an impression that there is a roadside marker, and they actually have a marker, where he actually landed. After the incident in South Carolina, Lowe returned to Philadelphia. At the same time, a reporter friend from the Cincinnati Commercial, Murat Halstead, sent a letter to Salmon Chase. In this letter, he wrote glowingly of Lowe and the military potential of balloons. So Chase responded favorably to Murat, and Murat, in a May 23, 1861 letter, advised Lowe to go to Washington City and bring his balloon. So on June 5th, Lowe arrived in Washington and immediately called on Professor Joseph Henry, and then, who again was the secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, and Lowe met with Chase, and Chase promised to talk to the president about Lowe. Henry then met with Secretary of War Cameron, who asked Henry to write a report of Lowe's balloons and potential military applications. On June 11th, Secretary Chase invited Lowe to the White House to meet personally with Abraham Lincoln. Professor Henry went with Lowe, and they spent the entire evening with the president. The president was deeply impressed and told Lowe that he would give the military possibilities of the balloon some serious consideration. So again, how to get invited to meet the President of the United States. It took many, many, many steps and people, but he finally was able to do it. Again, it shows the persistence of Professor Lowe. So Joseph Henry suggested to Lowe that he make a series of ascensions from the grounds of the Columbian Armory near the site of the current Air and Space Museum. The Armory had suitable coal gas for Lowe to use. So Lowe took Henry's advice and went aloft on June 18, 1861 with a telegraph operator. In addition to the tether for the balloon, a telegraph cable is attached to the balloon and runs to the White House and the War Department. The balloon is filled with gas from the Army and reached an altitude of 500 feet, nearly 2 football fields. So Lowe made history with this flight when he sent the first telegraph message from a balloon to the ground. These 3 sentences obviously were not written on a whim or by the seat of his pants. In this short message, Lowe accomplished 3 things. First, he states how far the field of view is and what types of military objects he can observe, girdles of encampments. Second, he proves that it's possible to use a telegraph to send real-time information back to the ground. And third, he reminds Lincoln of the availability of balloons for military service. He just doesn't tell Lincoln what he could do, he showed that he could do it. So after the flight was over, Lowe had the Enterprise brought to the grounds of the White House, where Lincoln observed it from a second-story window. He asked Lowe to come to the White House that evening and discuss the future. So Lowe was there late into the night, and it was there that he laid out to Lincoln his plans for an aeronautical corps with himself as the chief. The meeting ended with Lincoln writing a letter of introduction to General Winfield Scott, President Lincoln's military advisor. Oh yeah, I forgot to move ahead, sorry. Meh. Lowe went to the War Department to meet with General Scott. From the records I've looked at, it's hard to tell if Lowe ever actually gained an audience with Scott. General Scott showed no interest in working with Lowe. Lowe stated that Scott was now, quote, very infirm, pompous, with many of the affectations which sometimes go with extreme age, and was extremely difficult to engage his attention. His mind was centered on the makeup of the Army as he'd always known it, and he did not care for innovations. So that was Professor Lowe's opinion of General Scott. 3 days after meeting with President Lincoln, Lowe finally gets off the ground. The fact that Whipple contacted Lowe on the same day as Cameron read Professor Henry's report does not seem to be a coincidence. In this telegram, Whipple asked Lowe to bring his balloon and telegraph apparatus to Arlington, Virginia. And again, Whipple does this the same day that Joseph Henry completed his report to Secretary of War Cameron on the potential military applications of balloons. So at this time, this is Lowe's first mission, June 22nd, 24th, 1861. At this time, Union forces occupied portions of Fairfax County in Northern Virginia. This includes the Arlington House, Robert Lee's home, the heights around Arlington, down the Potomac River to Alexandria. Once you got out of the Falls Church, Fairfax Courthouse was more of a no man's land. Lowe got his first mission, which is with making a ascent near Falls Church and report back what he saw. So moving the balloon was a laborious process requiring about 20 men and a wagon. And I should note that the Enterprise was inflated throughout the whole journey to Falls Church, which is why it took so many men to handle the balloon. They did not inflate the balloon once they got to Falls Church. It was inflated in Washington, D.C. and transported. And so if we look at the steps, on June 22nd, the balloon Enterprise is inflated at Columbia Armory. Then it crossed Long Bridge, again inflated, camped at Arlington House and made just one ascent on the 22nd. On the 23rd, loaded the Enterprise on a train flatbed and moved it. And then on June 23rd, there was a short ascent to scout for Confederate pickets. And on 23rd to 24th, Enterprise makes multiple ascents at Falls Church. So now we'll note, the balloon that he's using is Enterprise, which is the same one that he used on his first test flight where he crashed in Unionville. So he's making good use of Enterprise. So this was his first mission, and by all accounts, a success. He was able to make these multiple ascents at Falls Church, and he was able to move the balloon from Washington, D.C. to Falls Church to make these ascents. However, Lowe was not the only aeronaut in Washington whose services were considered by the Army. James Allen was a young aeronaut who was well known in Rhode Island. His background was similar to Lowe's in that prior to the war, he performed exhibitions with balloons and charged patrons to make ascensions. By far, John Wise was the best known of the aeronauts. He had quite a reputation, and some would consider Lowe and Allen upstarts. Wise is considered the father of American aeronautics and had been flying balloons for many years. And if you'll remember, he led the four-man team that manned the Atlantic a few years before. So both men had chances to show their stuff in July 1861, and their efforts were also managed by Captain Whipple. So let's go over what happened with James Allen. James Allen had initially offered his services directly to federal authorities, but had no reply. Governor Sprague of Rhode Island ordered Allen to join the Rhode Island troops heading to Washington, D.C. So he took with him 2 balloons, a portable gas generator, and 5,000 feet of rope. Once he got to D.C., Allen contacted the War Department and had been placed under Major Albert Meyer, the chief signal officer. He made one flight on June 9th near the Capitol, which was a week before Lowe made his historic flight. Next day, with the Rhode Island troops, he went to Harper's Ferry, but he made no ascensions. He had trouble with his portable generator, so he couldn't inflate his balloon. Allen returned to Washington, D.C. in early July, and he was assigned to Captain Whipple, who was already working with Lowe. So on July 9th, Allen again attempted to inflate his balloon with his own portable generator and can only partially inflate the balloon. Based on the failure to inflate properly, future flights with Allen would be done by inflating the balloons with city gas and then transporting the balloon to the observation point, which is exactly what Lowe was doing. So Allen got his chance. He was ordered to move his balloons from Alexandria, Virginia towards Manassas. His small balloon burst on the morning of July 14th, and the large balloon struck a telegraph pole and deflated. So essentially, Allen was now out of the picture in terms of providing balloons or serving as a lead aeronaut. So he essentially failed. So now Lowe is getting mixed signals from Captain Whipple, who's been working with Allen and Wise. Whipple first tells Lowe the Army had decided to adopt the balloon for military purposes and to submit to build a war balloon. So on June 27th, he tells Lowe they decided to award a contract to John Wise to construct the military balloon. Wise's bid had come in $200 less than Lowe's, and he had a very solid reputation. But Whipple did offer Lowe the opportunity to serve as an aeronaut on Wise's balloon when it was built. Lowe strongly objected, stating that, quote, "I would not be willing to expose my life by using so delicate a machine, which should be made by a person in whom I had no confidence." And after all, he had already flown successful flights over Falls Church with Enterprise a few days earlier. He had a demonstrated capability. Lowe and Enterprise were not immediately ordered back to the field, so Lowe decided to do what he could to keep himself in the game and in public view. The newspapers are focused exclusively on Lowe and his balloon, and he got a lot of coverage. So he staged a series of demonstrations from June 25th to July 20th, 1861, with Enterprise on the grounds of the Smithsonian. And, a lot of newspapers, covered this. This was, again, his way of keeping his face front and center. Lowe gets another chance. The Union Army under General Irvin McDowell has started moving south towards Manassas in what would turn into the first battle of Bull Run. or First Manassas if you're a Southerner. Wise and his balloon are nowhere to be seen. Wise was supposed to have his balloon ready to support the Union Army as it moved to Manassas. Captain Whipple then asked Lowe to inflate Enterprise and move with the Army. Following Whipple's instructions, Lowe takes Enterprise to the Columbia Armory to be inflated and then move towards Manassas. But neither men nor transportation has been provided to Lowe. He decides to inflate Enterprise anyway, and is also in the process of starting to find men and transportation on his own, again, being as resourceful as he is. But while Lowe is actively inflating Enterprise, Wise shows up with his new balloon that was officially contracted for by the Army. He also shows up with a wagon and 20 men ready to transport his balloon. After a lengthy conversation, Lowe stepped aside and accompanied Enterprise from the gas line, and Wise took over. I would like to have heard that conversation. I'm sure there was some dicey language in there. So this is what happened to John Wise's balloon on July 20th, 1861, as he tried to get to the Battle of First Bull Run. So he inflated his balloon at Columbia Armory, just like Lowe did. Again, that's where they had their discussion. He crossed the Aqueduct Bridge, passed through Fairfax Courthouse, and then the balloon struck trees and was badly damaged, and he returned back to Washington, D.C. So he never made it to the battle. The balloon was repaired by July 26th, and Captain Whipple asked Wise to move his balloon again over the Aqueduct Bridge. As they were nearing Arlington House, a stiff breeze brushed the tether ropes against the telegraph lines, which cut the balloon free. The craft fell to earth near the Arlington House, so badly damaged it was no longer of use. The lifespan of Wise's balloon service was 5 days. So the balloon that he was contracted for is now no longer usable. Which means Lowe is the last man standing. Both Allen and Wise have failed. So on July 22nd, the day after the Battle of First Bull Run, Lowe inflates Enterprise on his own authority without orders. And he's talked into it by several patriotic individuals. So he gets the help of 20 men, some of whom had helped Wise inflate his own balloon the day before. So his balloon gets as far as Falls Church, where they got caught up in the general retreat of the Union Army after the defeat at Bull Run. It started to rain and wind started to pick up. Pickets were removed, so Lowe took his balloon back to Fort Corcoran, where he made a single ascension on July 24th. Lowe states that he achieved an altitude of 3.5 miles, and he observed the encampments of the enemy and their movements between Manassas and Fairfax. He was still using the same gas that he'd gotten from the armory 2 days before.
Yeah.
So again, he is being useful here. He's actually observing the movements and actions of the rebel army after the Battle of First Manassas. And again, he's also dealing with all of the retreating federal troops that are coming back to Washington, D.C. after the battle. The next day, Lowe tries something he is loath to do, an attempt at free flight over rebel lines. Now, at this point, all of his ascensions have been tethered. He's been tied to the ground and just essentially going straight up. According to his memoirs, he stated he did this because of rumors and reports that the rebels were marching in force towards Washington, again, after the Battle of Bull Run. So these stories created a lot of unrest and panic in Washington. So he decided to take the chance and perform a free flight over rebel lines so he could see what was going on. And all did not go as planned. So on the morning of July 24th, Lowe ascended with Enterprise from Arlington House. Using a lower current blowing towards the west, Enterprise floated west over Confederate lines. Once he was over Centerville, he decided he'd seen enough, and he rose to a higher current that blew the Enterprise back towards Union lines. His goal was to land back in Arlington, but that was not to be. As he started to descend, he was fired on by Union troops, which would not allow him to land. They yelled for Lowe to show his colors, but he had no flag. So the westward current took over due to Enterprise's descent, and Lowe was blown back towards Confederate positions. Lowe crash-landed on Mason's plantation, which was George Mason's home. The balloon had crashed into a thicket of trees and had been severely damaged. Lowe himself sprained an ankle, dropping to the ground from the basket. He managed to get the envelope down and stored it in the basket, and then he waited for darkness. Lowe's wife, Leontine, had went with him to Arlington House that morning. She had watched his entire flight, including the part where he was fired upon by friendly troops, and she saw him go down. She observed all of this with a powerful telescope, so she had a pretty good feel for where he went down, which was several miles beyond federal pickets. Volunteers from the 31st New York went with her to look for Lowe, and they sent scouts ahead. The scouts spotted Lowe, but they said it would be too risky to go after him with the 31st since that would bring on an engagement with the Confederates. So they reported this to Leontine, and she came up with a plan where she would retrieve Lowe disguised as a farm woman. So she got hold of a horse and a wagon and under cover of darkness went to look for her husband. She found him, and together they loaded the balloon and basket into the cart, and they reached Union lines without making contact with the Confederates. Now I gotta say, that's one heck of a marriage, okay? I mean, that says a lot. They stayed together their whole lives, okay? So that's a great story. The very next day, President Lincoln asked to meet with Lowe again. This meeting was arranged by, again, the Smithsonian's Joseph Henry, who had filled Lincoln in on all the difficulties Lowe was having getting approval from the War Department to become the chief aeronaut. At this meeting, according to Lowe, Lincoln expressed the thought that General McDowell had the information that only observations from a balloon could give. The result might have been different. Then Lowe and Lincoln discussed General Scott. You remember that guy? Yes. And his refusal to even meet with Lowe. This troubled Lincoln greatly since he assumed that the letter of introduction that he had written a month earlier would indicate to Scott the president's desire to move forward with Lowe and the balloon service. So Lincoln writes another note for General Scott. Please see Professor Lowe once more about his balloon. And again, there's no evidence that a meeting ever really occurred between Lowe and Scott. The next day, Lowe goes to visit General Scott with Lincoln's note. He tries 4 times to get an audience with Scott to no avail. Lowe goes back to the president, and Lincoln personally intervenes. President Lincoln and Lowe go to the War Department. Lincoln tells Scott that Lowe is organizing an aeronautics corps for the Army, and he is to be its chief. Lincoln directs Scott to write letters to Admiral Dahlgren and Captain Meigs with instructions to give Lowe everything he needs to equip the balloons on land and water. I love this plan. Let's do it, now that the president has come personally. Now, Lowe is not commissioned as an officer, but rather is left as a civilian. He's given a salary of $10 per day. And on July 29th, Captain Whipple orders Lowe to get Enterprise repaired as quickly as possible for use in the field. Lowe attempts to get Enterprise to the field, but Enterprise is damaged, and so is Lowe's reputation. After being inflated in Washington, D.C., Enterprise is partially damaged crossing Long Bridge. And again, can you imagine the difficulty of moving an inflated balloon through that? With 20 men and a wagon, horses. So it's partially damaged crossing the bridge. Once beyond Arlington Heights, a heavy rainstorm ensued, and Lowe deflated the balloon to keep it from getting damaged further. Captain Whipple was not happy. He was convinced that balloons were too fragile and recommended that their use be discontinued. So remember, he dealt with the failures of Wise, Allen, and now Lowe. He can't get any balloons up, and he's just frustrated with the whole thing. Again, that's the problem when you're using new technology in time of war. It's not very reliable. But he's about had it. Now, Whipple does not know about Lincoln's support of Lowe and the future balloon corps, so he's overruled, and a decision is made to award Lowe a contract to build the first balloon designed specifically for war. So Lowe travels to Philadelphia to oversee construction of the first balloon designed specifically for war, named the Union. This balloon was made of the best materials on hand, and to minimize leakage, 2 coats of varnish were used to seal the envelope. And also, given the prior experience of being fired on by his own troops, Lowe made sure the Union was decked out in patriotic colors with red, white, and blue bunting attached to the rigging, and large stars and stripes pennant was attached to the basket. I'm not going to get fired on by my own people again, okay? So all this and more was reported in Union newspapers. And here's an example of such an article from the Philadelphia Inquirer, August 8, 1861. This article even reports that Lowe was only given 10 days to construct the Union. And At that time, not much thought was given to leaking military secrets to the enemy during a time of war, but this was a big problem of Union newspapers at that time. They reported everything. And if you read this, they give dimensions of the balloon, all sorts of information about the materials used to build it, how it might be used. In this case, they're talking about maybe using it to drop bombs. But you can imagine if you're an intelligence officer for the Confederacy, this is a gold mine. And this kind of stuff happened all the time in Union newspapers. They really liked covering Professor Lowe because he was so interesting and what he was doing was so novel. So Union sees a lot of action. Union spent most of the time performing reconnaissance on Fairfax Courthouse and rebel positions at Falls Church, Munce's Hill, Upton's Hill, Bailey's Crossroads, etc. And his launch site for all of these flights was Fort Corcoran, again, which is where he was launched on his previous flights. And again, the balloon Union was still being inflated in Washington, D.C. at the Columbia Armory. Now, history is made again on September 24th, 1861, when Lowe went aloft in the Union and directed artillery fire by using a combination of flag signals and a telegraph. And again, he was asked to direct the fire from Fort Corcoran to targets near Falls Church. So again, he's made history here. First time artillery was directed by an airborne asset, which became, again, very common later on. We saw it in World War I, World War II, but it was done in the Civil War for the first time by Professor Lowe. Not only did Lowe go up in the balloons, but generals went aloft in the Union. So all of these generals who went aloft during this period became advocates of the balloon and Lowe. To see it is to believe it, right? You go up there and you see what Lowe sees and you become an advocate. So the biggest advocates were General Fitz-John Porter and most importantly, General George McClellan, who replaced General Irvin McDowell after his performance at Bull Run. There's no better advocate than the man at the top of the food chain, General McClellan. So to Lowe, Fitz-John Porter and McClellan were breaths of fresh air after his dealings with General Scott. But anyway, all of these generals went up in the balloon during that time period. So on September 16th, Lowe submits a plan, this is all again 1861, at General Porter's request for the organization of a regular balloon corps, and General McClellan approves. So Lowe asks for and receives funding for 4 balloons, 2 20,000 cubic foot capacity, 2 30,000 cubic foot capacity, and most importantly, portable gas generators to permit field operations. So he's not reliant on blowing up his balloons prior to use. And so the balloons were constructed in Philadelphia, and the gas generators were built in Washington, D.C. at the Naval Yard. Lowe split his time between Philadelphia and Washington, D.C. to supervise the construction of the balloons and the generators, which occurred from October to mid-November 1861. And just like with the construction of the Balloon Union a few months previous, the Philadelphia Inquirer reported all the details in its October 14th, 1861 article titled New Government Balloons. Again, there was no concept of operational security, and newspapers continued to be in a military intelligence coup for the Confederates. Now, the new balloons were the Intrepid, the Constitution, the United States, and the Washington. 2 other balloons were later added to the fleet, the Eagle and Excelsior. These were built with the intent of being able to be inflated quickly, where time was of the essence. They were half the size of the Union and Intrepid. Now, most importantly, in addition to balloons, Lowe designed and constructed 12 portable gas generators. These were built in the Washington Naval Yard, not Philadelphia like the balloons. This technology was a game changer. It meant that the balloons would be much more portable as their gas source would travel with the balloons. The base was a standard Army wagon body. On top was a wood box that contained a large tank. On the top of the box was a funnel where sulfuric acid was added. The sulfuric acid was mixed with iron filings, and the result was hydrogen gas. And here's a picture of 2 of the generators on the grounds near the Capitol. Again, these pictures were taken by Matthew Brady in early 1862. And here's an enlarged photograph. Notice that each generator had a unique number, in this case 8 and 7. Still self-promoting, the generators are labeled Lowe's Balloon Gas Generator. Generally, 2 of these would be assigned to a balloon. The wagon crew consisted of an aeronaut, an Army captain, and 50 non-commissioned officers and enlisted men to serve as wagoneers and ground crew. Additional wagons were also required to carry the sulfuric acid, the iron filings, washer, and coolers. So the balloons had quite a big logistical footprint. 6 of these generators were completed by the end of 1861. And here's one last picture. You can see the Capitol in the background through the haze. And here's another first for Professor Lowe. The first time an aircraft was launched from a ship, November 18th, 1861. A coal barge, the George Washington Parke Custis, was modified into a balloon boat during November 1861 with Lowe's direction. The barge was unpowered and needed to be towed by a steam tug. The new balloon Washington was sent on the barge to Budd's Ferry, Maryland, with Lowe and a new balloonist assistant, Paulin. So General Daniel Sickles made observation flights starting on November 18th, 1861. So to some historians, the barge George Washington Parke Custis was the first aircraft carrier, 1861.
Next.
And here's a drawing done in 1861 that shows the balloon Washington performing a reconnaissance of the rebel forces near Budd's Ferry. Again, note the large number of men that it took to launch and control the balloon. Also note the sandbags that are in a circle that were detached from the balloon as it was launched. And finally, note the portable generators at the bow of the barge. So I'm going to wrap up my presentation essentially because I was only talking about the origins of the Balloon Corps. I'm not covering their whole service unless you want to be here for 3 or 4 hours. But I'm going to wrap up and just say I'm going to give you just a wrap up of how it all ended. With multiple balloons in the Corps, Lowe hired other aeronauts to fill out the Corps, including rivals James Allen. The Corps provided service during the Peninsula Campaign, at the Battle of Fredericksburg, and at Chancellorsville in 1863. But after the Battle of Chancellorsville, the Balloon Corps fell apart as Lowe resigned and left the field due to broken promises regarding pay and disagreements with the superior officer, Cyrus Comstock, and about how the unit should be run. Comstock wanted Lowe to take the balloons up on a regular schedule so that intelligence reports would be generated on a regular basis. Lowe kept telling Comstock that launching balloons was heavily dependent on weather conditions, and this frustrated Comstock. Now, I'm just going to go over, what types of problems did the Balloon Corps actually have during the Civil War. Aeronauts were civilians. They never received military commissions, and this created several problems. They were considered civilian employees of the War Department with honorary titles, which led to difficulties with Army bureaucracy. Aeronauts were also concerned for their personal safety. If they were captured by the Confederacy, they could possibly be executed as spies, since they weren't actually in uniform. Aeronauts' families would not have been eligible for pensions if they had been killed or captured. Their civilian status caused some officers to question the credibility of the aeronauts, especially when no other source could verify the reported observations. Remember, Lowe was not trained in collecting military intelligence, whereas other officers who went out were, and they would know exactly what they were looking at. So their credibility was questioned quite a bit. Since they did not fall formally under an effective chain of command, the balloonists at times did not feel compelled to follow orders from their superiors. That's a constant problem. Wherever the balloon was near, it seemed like different officers were ordering up in the air. There was really no formal chain of command where he got orders from. Poor pay. At various points, the Army simply did not pay the balloonists the rates negotiated when their service began. On multiple occasions, Lowe's wife telegraphed him to inform him of their family's financial straits. Pay became a huge issue and did result in multiple balloonists resigning from the service, and this is one of the reasons why Lowe resigned. And transportation. The balloonists were at the mercy of their immediate military supervisor for transportation and logistical concerns. There was a lot of turnover amongst their immediate supervisors. This led to inefficiencies, and some commanders were much more attentive than others to the balloon service. For example, Lowe was unable to get his balloons to Antietam after his military supervisor left to assume command of a division. There were also no consistent support troops to help launch balloons. Nearby infantry regiments were roped into helping hold the ropes during tethered operations. So he had no dedicated crew to help him launch his balloons. He would just, hey, you in the 20th Maine, you want to help me launch this balloon? Thanks. For all of his charisma and personal courage, Lowe was not universally liked. Some saw him as a popinjay, some saw him as a self-promoter, some saw him as extremely possessive of the Balloon Corps, and he took some heat and he took it personally. He was very prickly. In Charles M. Evans' book, War of the Aeronauts, he speculates that the northern populace came to associate balloons with dramatic Union defeats in the first years of the war. And if you look at the battles that the balloons were used, they were all Union defeats. And it was a definite fact that the early high-ranking advocates of military ballooning were out of the picture General McClellan was gone. General Heintzelman was gone. General Fitz-John Porter was gone. Not only were the advocates gone, but they were replaced by men who had little or no interest in using the balloons. Meade and Grant had no interest at all in the balloons. But how effective were the Union balloons? And to look at this, we can just go ahead and look at the views from the Confederates' point of view. What did the balloons mean to them? So Colonel Edward Porter Alexander is best known as Chief of Artillery for the Army of Northern Virginia. He's uniquely qualified to speak on the usefulness of Union balloons, since he himself was one of the few Confederate officers to go up in a Confederate balloon. In his memoirs, he cites the appearance of Union balloons during Peninsula Campaign at Fredericksburg, and you notice that they stopped flying after May 1863, after the Battle of Chancellorsville. He stated, "I am sure that on certain occasions, skilled observers in the balloons could give information of priceless value. Balloons ought frequently permit the discovery of marching columns, and the very knowledge by the enemy of one's use of balloons is demoralizing and leads them in all their movements to roundabout roads and night marches, which are often very hampering. But the observers in the balloons should be trained staff officers, not the ignorant class of ordinary balloonists, which I think were generally in charge of the Federal balloons." And after the war, Confederate General James Longstreet confided to Lowe himself, "At all times, we were fully aware that you Federals are using balloons to examine our positions, and we watched with envious eyes their beautiful observations as they floated high in the air, well out of range of our guns. We were longing for balloons that poverty denied us." And I'm going to end with, I want to show you some photographs of the Balloon Corps during the Peninsula Campaign, 1862. All these pictures were taken by Matthew Brady, and these were all taken at the Battle of Fair Oaks on May 31st, 1861. If you want to see, the balloons in action. So here's a picture of the balloon Intrepid during the Battle of Fair Oaks being inflated. Again, you can see the men, actually handling the balloon, and the generators that are actually inflating the balloon. And again, these are pretty grainy shots, but here is, look at all of the men that it's taking here to actually launch this balloon. And you can see the box of the cage, with all of the stars on it, so that, again, they know that he's with the Union. And now we're actually showing it being launched. And again, a number of men holding the ropes. An enlargement of Professor Lowe at the Battle of Fair Oaks. Another picture of the balloon Intrepid being inflated. And this is actually a very nice shot. I've not seen this one at all until just recently, of it actually quite high over the Fair Oaks battlefield. And Currier and Ives created a lithograph of the Battle of Fair Oaks. This was actually created in 1862, and if you'll notice in the upper left, there's actually a balloon, in the background, which again shows the significance. They knew there was a balloon observing, and I will say this to the soldiers, anywhere these balloons were launched, the soldiers noticed and they wrote home about it. I was looking at some letters written by some men from the 83rd. Pennsylvania, and I specifically was looking to see what they observed during the Peninsula Campaign, and a number of them mentioned the balloons. They actually mentioned, Professor Lowe by name. So anybody who was around at this time and saw the balloons, they generally report on them back home because they were interesting. They were different. It wasn't a run-of-the-mill occurrence. Now, we're ending here. There's one other officer who went aloft. He didn't do it in 1861. He went up during the Peninsula Campaign in 1862. And this is sort of a trivia question. He went up, again, in 1862 during the Peninsula Campaign. Does anybody recognize him? He's famous. It's Custer, George Armstrong Custer. He was just a lieutenant then. He was serving on General McClellan's staff. General McClellan asked him to go up with Lowe to make observations, and he really didn't want to do it. He thought the contraption looked unstable. He jumped in the crate, and he actually sat down the bottom and didn't even want to look over the side. He talks about what it felt like rising up, and he really didn't like it. He was not a big fan of it, but he did it. He's George Armstrong Custer. He will do things, but he went up in the balloon. And let me see here. We just have, I just want to talk about the cultural impact of Balloon Corps, in our modern society. Like, what has been collected at museums, what types of historical markers are out there, films, books, magazines, that kind of thing. And this is only going to take a second, and then we can have questions and answers. But If you want to see Thaddeus Lowe's binoculars, they're at the Air and Space Museum on display. His personal barometer and case are also at the National Air and Space Museum. I brought up how anywhere the balloons served, there's generally a roadside marker or historical markers. And again, here's one talking about the Intrepid at Fair Oaks. We saw this picture already. And there's just a whole series of these. Again, anywhere that the balloons launched, there's historical markers. There's also memorials. Here's a 1962. This memorial was set up, Union and Confederate Balloon Corps in Richmond. Memorial to both Union and Confederate men who made ascensions with the Balloon Corps during the Civil War. This is on the grounds of the Virginia Aviation Museum near Richmond. So there's a memorial to the Balloon Corps. Again, there was a film made about it, and the one that I liked from 1972, High Flying Spy. I think you can actually watch part of this on YouTube if you're brave enough to watch it. It's not very good. It's not very accurate. I will say this. Now that I'm 65 and watched it, with not being 12 years old, it doesn't hold up very well. But it has the advantage of having Darren McGavin in it, who was in Christmas Story. We all know him, the dad. He's in it, and Stuart Whitman. While it's historically not very accurate, I think it captures the spirit of Professor Lowe and what he was trying to do. And you can sort of see in that picture on the right, they're sort of showing the launch from the barge, in that picture. And of course, I don't think they were fired upon like that by rebels, but that adds to the drama of the movie. But anyway, there's a film made, and in 1947, there's a comic strip, Abraham Lincoln's Fighting Flyer, and in looking at the first 2 pages of this, I actually think it's more accurate than the Disney movie. What they're doing in this comic book. So that's pretty well it. If you have any questions, I'm glad to field them. Thank you again for your attention and your interest in this topic. Like I said, I became interested in it when I was 12 years old, and it's sort of stuck with me through the years. Thank you. All right. Are there any? Oh.
There's an name is called.
Okay. Yes. So sure.
As long as you kept like balloons, have you ever been out on one?
Yeah, I'm not as brave as Professor Lowe. I like watching balloons. I know in Meadville they have I've gone to that. I've gone out to the Santa Fe to watch the balloon launches there. I've not yet gone up. But now that I'm 65, what have I got to lose? I think I might try it. I think I might try it now. I think we should all do that, right? If you got something, if not now, when? So I'm with you there. Yes.
It's so dumb.
No, it's not. There's no dumb questions.
Star Trek Enterprise was named after the Enterprise of Woodland.
No, I have a feeling it's probably named after some of the ships, that were named Enterprise. I don't think they're.
Sense being on Derek. Yeah.
Yeah, Gene Roddenberry. I'll have to look at the.
He's written on this.
Oh no, I like that. I mean, Gene Roddenberry.
I like the show.
I did too. It's one of my favorites.
But
as a boy, I think I was also watching Star Trek when I was 8 or 9. So.
You got our big range. Yeah, well, I watch again. But I'm just showing that the Fox Lot was called Enterprise.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to say it there. So.
But there's also enterprises even prior to the balloon enterprise. There was also naval ships named Enterprise for, during the Revolution, the War of 1812.
Naval ships.
So, but it is interesting. It is a balloon. It flies.
They could use a good name.
Yeah. Now, I can't confirm nor deny. Like I said, I haven't read enough Star Trek history, although I'm a fan. But that's a good question. That's not a dumb question. That's actually a very good question. The origins of yes.
I was thinking a lot on. I was good for you guys, Samuel Gunn, but I didn't go South Carolina back to Washington. April, it was
yes.
on the college side.
How do you get it back? I think once they established that he was not a spy, because that was their main concern, was that he was a spy. I mean, they talk about how he actually did take the time, even after he crashed, to actually take the envelope down, pack up, the crate. He had it with him, and so when they took him back into Unionville, he had all this with him. So every step of the way, he had his balloon with him. Once they established he was not a spy. Little they know that later on, the Enterprise would actually be in the service of the Union. That he would shortly thereafter offer his services, to the Union by meeting with President Lincoln. So they probably, in retrospect, probably shouldn't let him take it with them, but at that point they had no reason to stop him from taking his balloon with him. Because I remember like I said, when they transported him to Unionville, they took him on a wagon, and I'm sure they had the balloon with them when they took him in. Thank goodness, right? I mean, they got a lot of service, the original.